Chapter 1. Chris was only a few weeks into his freshman year at CDSU when he'd found the door. He was cutting across campus on his way to an early study group meeting when a sudden thunderstorm rolled in from the west. He looked up at the heavy black cloud overhead and quickened his pace. His beeline across campus had left him stranded in a wide, unfamiliar courtyard on the far end of the athletics complex with no shelter in sight. He hustled across the courtyard, but the rain caught up faster than he'd anticipated. A wall of rain swept past, heralded by a huge peal of thunder that made Chris jump. Squinting through the downpour, Chris struggled to make out the nearest building and headed towards a large silhouette off to his right. As he neared the building, a tall, featureless wall came into sight. He was somewhere behind the school's enormous fitness center, which apparently didn't have a rear exit. With lightning crackling down all around him, he ran alongside the building, frantically looking for the nearest entrance. Finally he saw it, partially hidden behind an overgrown clump of bushes, a rusty old door set back into the wall. He tried the handle. To his surprise, it was unlocked. He threw himself inside the door and found himself in a small, darkened passage with old, leaky pipes running the length of the room. It was eerily quiet, the thick cinder-block walls muting the sound of the storm outside enough to hear the water dripping off his soaked clothes. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he turned and looked at the door he had just entered through. He realized that, strangely, it didn't seem to have any sort of handle on the inside. He wouldn't be able to pull it back open to leave when the storm passed. He swallowed the urge to panic and turned away from the door. He'd have to find another way out. CDSU was well known for having a very successful, well-funded sports program and boasted an impressive athletics complex that seemed to house facilities for every sport imaginable. The fitness center, which he found himself in now, featured weight rooms, aerobics studios, racquetball courts, and areas for treadmills and stationary bikes, all centered around an Olympic-sized pool, with an indoor track that circled the upper levels of the building. 2 large gymnasiums attached to the fitness center were used for everything from basketball games to volleyball tournaments. He'd taken a brief tour of the facilities when he'd first arrived on campus, but he definitely didn't recognize the room he was in now. Walking deeper into the room, it became obvious that it was actually some sort of access room for maintenance crews, with various panels and valves arranged on the walls. The room led a ways into the building, then curved off to the left, revealing a tight corridor stretching off into the distance, with flickering fluorescent lights lighting the way every couple yards. Chris glanced back at the locked door behind him one last time and then, sighing, set off cautiously down the hall. The pattern of pipes grew denser and more complicated as he went. It seemed he was heading into the heart of the building as he followed the corridor. After a few minutes' walk snaking deeper and deeper into the building, the hall suddenly terminated at a dead end, leaving Chris face to face with a sturdy metal ladder leading up the cinder-block wall ahead of him and out of sight. Peering up, Chris could see a faint light at the top. He weighed his options glumly. Right now, whatever was up there was probably his best shot at finding an exit. He took a deep breath and stepped up onto the first rung. It was a scary climb, going straight up in the dark, and he paused every couple rungs to wipe his clammy hands off on his jeans. After a few minutes of careful climbing, Chris finally reached the top of the ladder and clambered up a set of handrails onto solid ground. He looked back at the ladder leading down and frowned. He reckoned that he must have gone up at least 2 or 3 stories. It was really going to suck if he had to turn around and climb back down. He scanned his new surroundings. The ladder had led to another corridor much like the one he just left, a tight cinder-block passage lined with ductwork and pipes, illuminated every so often by a small bare bulb. Pressing onward, he made his way cautiously down the passageway until finally it turned sharply to the right, revealing a door at the end of a small, dark hall. Chris breathed a sigh of relief. This door had a handle. He broke out into a jog towards the exit, but as he reached the door, the unmistakable sound of girls' voices suddenly filled the hall. Chris stopped and looked around. There it was again, girls' voices filtering up from somewhere. His curiosity getting the better of him, he turned from the door and walked back a few paces towards the source of the sound. Crouching down, Chris found himself looking out of a large slatted grate built into the wall. Looking down, he saw a group of young women on the floor below, climbing and balancing and stretching and flipping on an assortment of colorful gymnastics mats and equipment. It was one of the gymnasiums, he realized. He must have been somewhere up over the rafters looking down onto the women's gymnastics team's practice session. And they had no idea he was watching. Part of him felt a little dirty, but it didn't hurt to just look, he told himself. The girls were beautiful, each of them toned and flexible, and each of them in a tight leotard, some with workout shorts or leggings, some lingering by the sidelines in warm-up suits. Chris looked over at the door off to his side. He'd only stay for a minute. In the end, he'd stayed to watch until the coach had blown the whistle and the team returned to the locker room. With the show over, he finally opened the door there by the slatted grate and left, unnoticed, and made his way downstairs, exiting by the front of the building. The storm had long since passed, and though he had missed the study group he'd meant to attend, he still had just enough time to make it across campus to his next class. But even after leaving the fitness center, the experience up above the rafters had dominated his thoughts. He'd never considered himself a voyeur before, but he'd had to admit that there was something thrilling about watching the girls up there in the rafters. It wasn't sexual, exactly, but there was something exciting about it that gave him an electric sort of pleasure. Hiding in a room he wasn't supposed to be in, seeing things he wasn't supposed to see, it had been a jolt of adrenaline in an otherwise miserable wet day. He barely slept that night. The next day, he arrived on campus early and anxiously made his way to the back of the fitness center to try the rusty door again. Chapter 2. He had been crouched there by the grate for over an hour when he had the sudden feeling of a presence behind him. A stifled yelp escaped his throat as he turned around to see the woman standing silently behind him. Somehow he hadn't heard her come in. He fell to the floor, scrambling backwards against the wall as she slowly approached him. His fear crescendoed to a dull roar when he recognized her. It was the head gymnastics coach. He had seen her the day before on the gym floor, instructing the girls and assistant coaches. She towered over him in a red warm-up suit, her dark hair cropped in a tight buzz cut that gave her the air of a military commander. "What are you doing up here?" She spoke in a flat tone, but Chris could sense a certain, scary power behind her voice. She looked him over carefully as he tried to blurt out an excuse. I was only, it's not dash fuck. He'd been caught red-handed. I see. Well, I've got an idea, then. Come with me. She reached out and grabbed him by the wrist, pulling him to his feet in a single, powerful motion. She kept a firm grip on his arm as she led him out the door. Still half in shock, Chris let himself be led down the hall. The coach produced a ring of keys from her pocket, opened a door and guided him inside, locking the door behind them. It was an empty workout room. The walls were mirrored from floor to ceiling, and a large flat-screen TV hung from a stand in a corner of the room. Still gripping his arm, the coach walked him across the room and around a corner into an adjacent locker room. Taking him roughly by the shoulders, she turned him around and plucked his wallet out of his back pocket, then sat him down firmly on a wooden bench between two rows of lockers. She flipped his wallet open and pulled out his student ID, examining it carefully. Actually, I should probably just go. Chris stammered. He lifted himself off the bench to stand up. She shoved him back down and leaned down into his face, her voice suddenly cold. You were up there over the gym yesterday, too, weren't you? How long have you been up there spying on my team? It was just yesterday, I swear. Chris shook his head frantically. The coach glowered at him suspiciously for a moment, then stood and crossed her arms. Well, maybe this is something we can solve without getting the school involved. You can choose. Either you cooperate with me, or I'll make sure you're expelled. What will it be? Chris felt himself go pale. There was no way out of this if he was expelled for being a peeping Tom. His life was over. He lowered his eyes to the floor and nodded submissively. I'll cooperate. Excellent. The coach smiled thinly and turned towards the row of lockers behind her, pulling her ring of keys out again to unlock a locker. Let's see, then, one of these should fit. Her voice trailed off as she rifled through the hangers inside. Here we go. She turned and presented him with a bright purple leotard. Chris, bewildered, tried to voice a complaint, but she cut him off with a menacing glare. Since you're so interested in gymnastics, I'm enrolling you in a special one-on-one program where you'll learn everything there is to know about being a gymnast. I think it will do you some good. In fact, I promise you'll notice a difference in yourself when we're through." She shoved the leotard into his hands. "Now get dressed." Chapter 3. Chris had never been so embarrassed in his life. He was standing in the middle of the workout room wearing the leotard, surrounded by mirrored walls on every side. He examined his reflection with a morbid curiosity. The leotard was made of a shiny, stretchy purple fabric with long sleeves and a wide, scooped neck. It was soft and light, but wrapped tightly around his body, outlining every detail of his slim frame. His legs and neck prickled in the cold air of the room. He wrapped his arms around himself with a shiver and glanced at the door, thankful there wasn't a window in it. He felt absolutely ridiculous in this getup. The coach eyed him as she approached from across the room. "Worried someone might be watching?" she asked, mockingly. She had caught the direction of his gaze and seemed to guess what he was thinking. She let the question hang in the air. Chris could only look at the floor as she paced around him. "My name is Coach Matthews. From now on, when I ask you a question or give an instruction, you will respond as such. Is that clear?" "Yes, Coach Matthews," Chris answered resignedly. "Excellent. Let's get started, then. Today you'll simply follow along with this video." She pressed a button on a remote control. The TV lit up and the DVD player mounted beneath it spun up with a whir. Coach Matthews produced his student ID card from her pocket with a flourish. "I'll be filling out your paperwork over here, Chris. Hopefully you won't have to drop a class to make room for this one." She smiled thinly. Oh God, she was enrolling him in an actual class. And she had all his information now. There was no getting away from her after this, Chris realized. Coach Matthews stood under the TV and began filling out a form on a clipboard, eyeing him as music started up on the screen above her. Chris looked up at the TV. A woman in colorful aerobics gear was starting a series of stretches, calling out instructions as she went. Upbeat, jazzy music played in the background. Chris sighed and began clumsily following along. It was easy stuff at first, just toe touches and lunges, but the woman moved quickly through the different moves and it was tricky trying to match her movements while keeping his eyes on the screen. The worst part about it was that it was making him very aware of the leotard. With every movement it stretched and slid over his body, sending a tingle down his spine. Against his will, he found himself sporting an erection that only grew harder as the exercises continued. Soon he was rock hard and painfully aware of the leotard tenting out over his belly. Had the coach noticed his arousal? He turned his head to see her shaking her head with smirking disapproval. Cringing, he quickly returned his attention to the screen. The music was picking up and the instructor was beginning a more intense series of exercises, swinging her arms and lifting her legs to the beat. Chris followed along obediently, concentrating hard as he tried to keep up. He could still feel Coach Matthews' eyes on him, his shameful throbbing cock bobbing along under him as he moved. His humiliation was reflected back at him in the mirrored walls around him from every angle. He felt like crying every time he caught a glance of himself. Was this really happening? The music pulsed harder and he turned his attention back to the video. He just had to concentrate on finishing the exercises. But now it seemed as if the woman's words were getting garbled somehow. The harder he tried to make it out, the deeper it drew him in. The music grew more intense and abstract until it was just a cloud of jumbled beats and tones, the screen flashing a confusing array of bright patterns and colors and words that went by too fast to see. Somewhere deep in the haze the woman was still working out and Chris continued to stretch and dance along with the video, slowly becoming less and less aware of his surroundings as the video slowly enveloped his consciousness. Coach Matthews stepped out of the room. The boy in the leotard on the other side of the door was already so entranced he hadn't even noticed her leave, a hypnagogic pattern of flashing lights washing over his face as he danced. Chris returned to his dorm feeling exhausted and mentally drained. It was dark out now. How long had he been in that workout room, anyway? It felt like he'd been following that corny aerobics video for hours when Coach Matthews finally turned off the TV. He was sore all over, his arms and legs ached and burned like he just ran a marathon. He could have cried when Coach Matthews had told him they'd be having class 5 times a week, but it wasn't the workout he was dreading, it was the humiliation he knew he'd have to endure. He had never felt so ashamed as he had today. But at least he'd finally gotten out of that leotard and out of that room, away from her, if only for a little while. There was something about Coach Matthews that frightened him more than the threat of expulsion. He knew he was at her mercy now. What would she have him do next? Wearily, he realized that whatever she had planned, he had no choice but to comply. Chris let himself into his room and flopped face down on the bed. He closed his eyes and was asleep almost immediately. Chapter 4. Chris slowly opened the door to the mirrored workout room and peeked his head inside cautiously. Coach Matthews was already there, waiting for him. "Oh good, you decided to show up," she said, looking up from her clipboard. "Welcome to the first real day of class. Your first lesson is about personal hygiene. Before we work out today, I want you to go into the locker room and take a shower. Make sure you use all the products I've left in there for you." With Coach Matthews waiting impatiently outside, Chris entered the locker room and stripped his clothes off. A wire basket of plastic bottles was waiting for him on the floor near one of the showers. He picked up the bottle of shampoo, read over the label skeptically and cracked open the cap. A strong aroma of flowers and perfume wafted up. He frowned. Turning on the water, he stepped into the warm stream and began washing his hair. Next was a cleanser for his face. He scrubbed his face and neck. As he rinsed off, he noticed an intense but pleasant tingle. The last bottle looked like body wash at first glance, but had special instructions to leave it on his body for 3 minutes before rinsing, and not to get it on his scalp or face. He coughed as he opened the cap. Unlike the other bottles, whatever was in this one had a pungent, chemical smell. He poured some into his hand, dutifully coating his body with it as instructed by the label. Standing to the side of the water coming from the shower, he counted the time as best he could in his head. As he neared 3 minutes, he suddenly felt an uncomfortable burning sensation all over. He yelped, jumping back under the water to rinse the chemical off his skin as fast as he could. Chris stooped to wipe the goo off his legs, recoiling as a clump of wet hair slapped against the tile floor. "What the fuck? Why didn't you tell me this was going to happen?" Chris gestured wildly at his body. Coach Matthews had come into the locker room, and now he stood in front of her with a towel around his waist, completely hairless from the neck down. "Body hair is unsanitary and unsightly. I require all my gymnasts to maintain good hygiene," she replied sternly. "Now change into your uniform and meet me outside." Chris glared at the floor for a moment. He'd never been so humiliated in his life, but knew he had no recourse against whatever bizarre punishments she wanted to dish out. "Yes, Coach," he grumbled. As Coach Matthews left the room, Chris looked over at the purple leotard laid out on the bench in front of him. It had been washed and seemed fresh and clean despite yesterday's marathon workout. His heart sank at the sight of it. He'd been hoping that yesterday's ordeal had been a one-time punishment to teach him a lesson, but this was clearly going to be his uniform for the rest of the semester. He sighed. This class was nothing but a thinly disguised torture session. Dropping his towel, picked up the leotard and stepped into it gingerly, trying to delay the inevitable. But as the fabric brushed over his legs, he let out a short gasp. The soft material on his newly hairless skin felt amazing. It was like his skin had instantly become twice as sensitive. He slid the leotard up his legs and over his chest slowly, marveling at the sensation. He slipped his arms into the sleeves one at a time, his body tingling with a weird electric excitement as the shiny fabric stretched tight against his body. With the suit in place, he adjusted the fit, straightening the seams on his arms and smoothing out the fabric over his torso, then slipped his thumbs into the leg holes and slid them back, pulling the bottom of the suit down over his butt and letting it snap into place. He blushed, suddenly realizing it was a maneuver he'd seen the girls on the team do with their uniforms from up in the rafters. He must have picked it up subconsciously. Fully dressed, his whole body was now radiating with an intense, sensuous pleasure. He took a moment to luxuriate in the feeling. God, he was practically buzzing. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and tried to collect himself. He looked down at his spandex-clad body, his face flush. What was going on? He didn't feel anything like this yesterday. Heck, he didn't feel anything like this 2 minutes ago. He'd been embarrassed and uncomfortable standing there in his towel, but now he suddenly felt good, really good. There was something about the tight, shiny embrace of the leotard that made him feel sleek and strong, sexy, even. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad, after all. The thought floated up from the back of his mind, and the trauma of his experience in the shower seemed to fade away. Maybe he could get used to this. Coach Matthews looked Chris over silently as he exited the locker room. The boy had been defeated and angry only a few minutes earlier, but now he almost seemed to be glowing as he took his position in the middle of the workout room. Yesterday's training session had apparently worked very well. She watched, suppressing a smile, as the boys admired his reflection in the mirrored walls. He craned his neck, turning this way and that to examine his profile in the shiny leotard. "You look much better now, don't you think?" she prompted him. "Not like yesterday with all that nasty body hair poking out everywhere." "Yes, Coach," he responded absently. "Do you like wearing your leotard, Chris?" Chris was miles away now, running his hands down his sides as he turned and preened in the mirror nearest him. His cock was rock hard, straining against the front of his suit, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Coach Matthews chuckled. "I knew you'd come around." She walked over to the TV, remote in hand. The screen lit up and Chris drowsily turned to face it, a vacant expression on his face. After class, Chris was still in a haze. Sitting in the locker room in his regular clothes again, he felt heavy and sluggish. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his brain. The whole workout had seemed to go by in a blur. He remembered changing out of his clothes after the shower, but then, why was it so hard to remember? "Here, take this, you'll feel better." Coach Matthews approached him holding a big plastic cup in one hand. Chris took it from her almost automatically. The cup was cold in his hand and he drank eagerly from the wide straw. It was some sort of smoothie, icy and thick with a fruity cherry flavor. He could taste a weird metallic tang in it, but gulped it down without complaint. Coach Matthews watched him carefully as he drank, waiting for him to finish it all. "I'm putting you a special diet starting now. The smoothie you just had contains special supplements to make sure your body is getting all the nutrients it needs. They're going to be an integral part of your new diet and exercise regimen." Taking the empty cup from him, she handed him a pamphlet detailing his new diet. "With all the exercise you're going to be doing, it's not healthy to be as thin as you are right now, so you're going to be taking in a lot of extra protein and calories from now on." "Kind of like a bodybuilder?" he asked, glancing over the paper. There seemed to be a lot of rules about what he could and couldn't eat. "Not quite," she chuckled. "I have a very specific shape in mind for you." Chapter 5. Chris' daily workout class continued for the next few weeks with pretty much the same routine every time. He would change into his leotard, exercise with the video, then shower and change back into his clothes. Coach Matthew would watch as he drank one of her health drinks and then he'd go on with his day. And while he had first shown up reluctantly, any apprehension he had seemed to melt away as soon as he changed into his leotard. He couldn't explain why, exactly, but he just felt so comfortable wearing it. When he wasn't working out, he found himself missing the sensation of his leotard, the soft fabric moving and stretching with his body. It felt right, somehow. When the class was over, he almost didn't want to take it off. The class had gradually begun to feel less and less like a punishment. In fact, it had quickly become the highlight of his day. To his own surprise, he found himself actually looking forward to his sessions with Coach Matthews. Meanwhile, everything else had seemed to fade into the background. His old hobbies and extracurriculars had fallen to the wayside as anything outside of working out and going to school had started to feel like almost too much to deal with. He just didn't have the energy to think about anything else anymore. At first he'd struggled to clear his thoughts, but now he found it easier to just focus on the important stuff, mostly spending his free time studying or minding his diet or concentrating on his next workout session. Whatever social life he'd developed when he'd first started college was over now, but his grades were good and he hadn't broken his diet even once. And with all the diet and exercise, there had been a real change in his physique over the weeks, though it had been happening so fast he'd barely been able to process it. He had a vague notion that his posture was better, his arms were more toned and his thighs seemed to be getting stronger and thicker. At any rate, he felt more fit and in shape than he ever had before. Chris was in the fitness center now, on his way to the workout room. When he arrived, Coach Matthews was there to greet him, as always. "Good, you're here. As you know, today is your final exam of the semester. I'll be running you through all the skills you've learned so far and reviewing your progress. Go get changed and we'll begin." She glanced up from her clipboard and gave him a conspiratorial look. "By the way, I've left you something in the locker room I think you'll like." "Yes, Coach Matthews," Chris gave a nervous reply and headed to the locker room. What could it be? He saw it as soon as he entered the locker room, his eyes lighting up at sight of it laid out on the bench, a new leotard. His pulse quickened as he picked it up and examined it. It was a slick, glossy pink with a glittery, rhinestone-encrusted white swirl across the front and a long zipper running down the back. The fabric was shiny and smooth in his hands, with a hologram sheen. It was beautiful. He quickly shoved his clothes off and gently stepped into his new treasure. Reaching behind himself, he zipped himself up, the high turtleneck of the suit softly encircling his neck. Coach Matthews looked him over as he re-entered the aerobics room in his new prize, an almost giddy expression on his face. The pink leotard was stretched tightly over his body and seemed to fit him like a glossy second skin. "This one is yours to keep, and I expect you to take good care of it. This kind of Leo is custom-made for important occasions like competitions and meets, but I want you to wear it today to try it out." "Wow, thank you, Coach Matthews, I love it," Chris blurted out. He could barely contain his excitement, his own competition leotard. He looked himself over in the mirrored walls, tracing the white swirl across his chest with his fingers. "Well, let's see if you've earned it, first." She motioned him towards the center of the room. "Take your position, please." Coach Matthews led him through a series of warm-ups, then took him through all the positions and stretches he'd learned from his videos. He moved with an intense concentration, his body swaying with steady, graceful motions. The outline of his cock was clearly visible, hard and bulging under the shiny pink fabric of his new leotard. She eyed him carefully, making careful notes as he bent, flexed, and twisted in the middle of the room. His body had begun changing drastically in recent weeks. The hormone-laden smoothies he drank every day were clearly working as designed, and his diet and exercises were only further enhancing his changing build. The skin-tight leotard showed off every detail, from his soft belly and arms to his plump, round ass and wide hips supported by thick, smooth legs. Beneath the shiny pink fabric, two small, soft mounds jiggled on his chest as he moved. Chris turned to assume a new position, looking up at her from the floor as he held a stretch. Coach Matthews stared back analytically. His features were softening nicely, the hard edges of his face smoothing out and his facial hair fading away, giving him a youthful, androgynous appearance. A silky blonde ponytail bobbed behind his head as he moved. His hair had grown quickly, the chemicals he'd been showering with were working their magic quite well. Coach Matthews nodded, satisfied. He was definitely beginning to look the part. She was almost surprised at how fast and how nicely all the various changes had taken effect. He was well on his way, now, almost ahead of schedule. Chris eased into a front split with his right leg out until his butt was flat on the floor. He held position with his head in the air, fighting off the urge to look down at himself. He hadn't realized just how flexible he'd become. Weird as it was, this was the first time he'd done anything without having to concentrate on a video, and he hadn't really had the opportunity to appraise his new abilities before. He effortlessly shifted into the side splits at Coach Matthews' command, then into another front split, this time with his left leg out in front. He held the split, back arched and looking straight ahead, feeling slightly stunned as he waited for the next command. "Wow," he thought to himself, "it's like I'm made of rubber." "Excellent, Chris. Very good." Coach Matthews gave him a small round of applause. Chris smiled, panting a little, as he slowly lifted himself from the floor. He rested his hands on his thick hips, a feeling of pride washing over him. He couldn't believe Coach Matthews was so pleased with him, but he'd been practicing so hard that the movements had come to him almost automatically today. "You're progressing very nicely." Coach Matthews smiled. "I think we're ready to move to the next stage." She handed him a large, bright pink canvas gym bag. "I want you working on your skills at home over the summer. This bag has a new set of workout videos for you to follow, and I've given you some new workout gear, along with enough smoothie mix to last the semester." "Yes, Coach Matthews." Chris nodded his head eagerly and slung the strap of the gym bag over his shoulder. He glanced at his reflection, pleased with how nicely the pink matched his new leotard. "That's all for today. We'll be working on a new project starting next semester. I'm very impressed with your progress so far, Chris. Make sure you keep it up over the break." "Thank you, Coach Matthews, I will," Chris replied happily. Dismissed, Chris returned to the locker room to shower, his thoughts already turning to the summer ahead. It didn't even cross his mind that Coach Matthews had signed him up for another entire semester without asking. Chapter 6. Chris closed the door to his dorm room behind him and tossed his gym bag on his bed. He paused, catching sight of himself in the mirror hanging on the bathroom door. He turned and studied his reflection, absent-mindedly brushing a strand of blonde hair from his face. Something in the mirror had caught his attention just now. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, though. His hair looked fine. Nothing on his face. Shirt was clean. He paused, frowning, his gaze lingering on his chest. 2 round bumps were causing his shirt to tent out slightly. That was normal, too, right? Wasn't it? Or... He reached a hand up his shirt to feel his chest, gently cupping one of the soft mounds in his palm. His nipple was swollen and tender, the thick, erect nub pressing hard against his hand. His pulse quickened. How had he not noticed this before? It felt almost like he had breasts, but that wasn't possible. He wasn't supposed to be growing breasts, was he? He squeezed, experimentally, and was rewarded with a pulse of deep, dull pain. He winced, dropping his hand with a gasp. For a brief moment, the cloud he'd been living under the last few months cleared and a feeling of confusion swept over him. Something wasn't adding up, but what? It was right on the tip of his tongue, but the pain was subsiding now, and the fog was rolling back in quickly. Chris blinked, looking around the room in a daze. He had just been thinking about something. He had the sense it had been something important, but he'd completely lost his train of thought just now. Had it been something in the mirror? He checked his reflection again. Didn't seem like there was anything out of the ordinary there. He shook his head with a chuckle and turned from the mirror. Clearly he'd been working too hard lately. There were more interesting things to concentrate on at the moment, anyway. Chris turned his attention back to the gym bag, opening it carefully to reveal a package containing 3 brand new training leotards. He pulled them from the bag breathlessly and removed them from their packaging, examining each of them carefully as he laid them on the bed. The first was black with bold yellow sleeves and thick yellow stripes running along the sides of the torso. The next was a tank style in matte black with pink straps around the neck and shoulders. The last one was another tank with a glossy blue fabric and black straps crisscrossed on the back. He didn't know why, but seeing them all laid out on his bed made him almost lightheaded with excitement. To think, he'd been so reluctant to wear something like this only a few months ago, and now he couldn't wait to try them all on. He giggled to himself. He'd been so freaked out that first day with Coach Matthews. How could he have ever felt so embarrassed about something so silly? Setting the leotards aside, he returned to the gym bag and pulled out the remaining set of clothes. Coach Matthews had also supplied him with a few pairs of spandex workout shorts and some simple black leggings. They were obviously for girls, but Chris didn't register anything wrong with that. He was already changing out of his clothes, eager to try on his new gear. He selected the sleeveless black and pink Leo and pulled it up his body carefully, then stepped into a pair of shorts. He examined his reflection again in the mirror, smoothing out the fabric over his stomach and adjusting the straps on his shoulders. He smiled at his reflection, pleased with how sporty he looked. Fully kitted out for his workout, Chris took the first disc out of the bag and fed it into his laptop. He pressed play and stepped back, ready for instruction. The video began playing a moment later, bathing the room in a dizzying pattern of light and sound. Chris looked over his dorm room at the big pile of shopping bags he just set down on the floor. After his workout earlier, he'd had a strange urge to go to the mall. It wasn't the sort of thing he usually liked to do, and where usually he'd just go the electronics shop there and browse through their video games or maybe walk around the bookstore for a little bit. Today he had made a beeline for the big department store. He'd shopped all night, not leaving until the mall had started closing down for the night. His parents had given him a credit card for emergencies when he'd first left for college. He'd felt a twinge of guilt using it on a shopping spree, but right now, as he thought about the boring t-shirts and jeans he'd been wearing, he couldn't imagine a bigger emergency. His parents would understand. Chapter 7. Hello, Chris. New haircut, I see. Looks good. Coach Matthews feigned disinterest as Chris entered the workout room sporting his new look for the first day of the new fall semester. The boy's hair had been cut into a cute chin-length bob, his neat blonde bangs resting over delicately shaped eyebrows. Instead of his usual uniform of jeans and a t-shirt, Chris was wearing a simple powder blue dress with a little gray cardigan to cover his arms. The dress hung just above his knees, revealing a pair of soft gray tights. His dirty old sneakers were gone, replaced with a dainty pair of flats. His fingernails were freshly manicured and coated with a lovely shade of light pink, and his lips hurry up and change into your workout gear. We've got a lot to cover today. Yes, Coach Matthews, he chirped. His voice had cracked some time over the summer break and was now bright and melodic. Coach Matthews smiled approvingly as Chris made his way to the locker room. He had obviously watched his new videos over the break. She'd had a pretty good idea of what he would be wearing today, and he had not disappointed. She smirked, picturing him back in his dorm room planning his little outfit for the first day of school. It was a shame she hadn't been there to see him walking around campus showing off his new look. Chris set his gym bag down with a sigh. Summer break had seemed like a blur. He'd gone home to visit his parents for a weekend and told them all about his newfound passion for gymnastics. Sadly, they hadn't been as excited for him as he'd thought they'd be, but they had promised him they would support him in his new lifestyle, whatever that was supposed to mean. Other than that, things had been pretty boring. He'd kept himself busy with his DVDs and his fitness routine and continued to practice all the moves and stretches he'd learned, not wanting to disappoint Coach Matthews when class started back up. He was extra eager to get started with Coach Matthews again. He'd felt a strange anxiety all day. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he'd had that odd, nagging feeling that something was wrong again. He'd been waiting all day to get into a leotard and start working out. That always seemed to get his mind off things. He carefully hung his new clothes up in a locker, unzipped his gym bag and slipped into his black and yellow practice leotard. He frowned. The feeling was still there. He looked down at his body, nervously smoothing the soft fabric over his belly. His hand brushed against his penis and he frowned again. On impulse, he reached down and tucked his member back between his legs. He tugged at the suit, making small adjustments here and there, then gently ran his fingers between his legs, examining his handiwork. With the tight fabric of the leotard holding everything firmly in place, his crotch now looked smooth and flat. Chris exhaled. A familiar calm came over him, and his mind seemed to clear instantly. His mouth curved into a placid smile as he exited the locker room. Must have just been first-day jitters, he thought to himself. Coach Matthews looked up, observing Chris carefully as he re-entered the workout room. The bulge he'd unconsciously sported all last semester was tucked away, completing the image of a shapely young woman. Today marked a big step in his transformation. She'd been keeping tabs on him over the summer, and everything indicated that a new feminine persona was taking hold strongly inside him. He would soon be at the point of no return. Well, Chris, it's time to take your lessons to the next level. We won't be meeting in this room anymore. Follow me and I'll show you our new practice space. Yes, Coach Matthews. They rode the elevator down in silence, the doors opening to the bustling activity of the main floor of the fitness center. Chris padded barefoot behind Coach Matthews, his hips wiggling as he walked. It occurred to him that just a few months ago he would have died if he'd had to leave the privacy of the workout room in nothing but a leotard. But now he knew he was going to be a gymnast, and gymnasts wore leotards. What was the big deal? He smirked to himself as they passed through a bank of students working out on treadmills and elliptical machines, barely noticing the trailing eyes. Finally, on the other side of the building, Coach Matthews opened a large double door and led him inside. Big colorful mats and foam cushions of various shapes and sizes were arranged around the room alongside an assortment of uneven bars, balance beams, vaults, and trampolines. It was the gymnasium where the gymnastics team practiced. Chris realized he had never actually seen it from the ground. He looked around wide-eyed, his gaze briefly straying up to the vents above the rafters. Finally arriving at the edge of the large spring floor spanning the center of the gym, Coach Matthews stopped and turned to face Chris. This semester, I'm going to be training you to perform a floor routine here. The final routine will be just over a minute long and you'll be learning a bit of tumbling as well as some dance components. You already have a good degree of flexibility and you know quite a few moves already, so I think you'll pick things up rather quickly. Chris listened intently, his hands clasped together tightly. He had never been more excited. Chapter 8. Chris was in his dorm room getting dressed for school. The last few weeks at practice had progressed quickly with Coach Matthews helping him learn some basic moves and fundamentals before moving on to tumbling and flips. Chris took to the new skills with an uncanny ease and the floor routine had come together quickly. But today was the big day. After slowly building up to it, he was finally going to perform his entire floor routine for the first time. He reached behind his back and connected the hooks on his bra. It really hadn't fazed him when his chest had begun to grow again last month and he was actually kind of proud of his breasts. He just had little bee stings for a while, but now he was a perky bee cup with ample cleavage. Bras had been kind of a hassle at first, but now they were basically a requirement if he wanted to go out without giving people a free show. Inside his panties, his little nubbin was tightly tucked away between his thick thighs. It had been shrinking rapidly over the last few months, and while it had concerned him at first, Chris now actually felt a strange sense of relief when he thought about it. It was so much easier to keep it tucked out of the way, now, for one thing. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he rolled a thick pair of black tights up his legs, then stood, wiggling as he pulled the waistband up over his hips. Next, he pulled on a tiny pair of high-waisted denim shorts and zipped them up. It was his favorite pair. They made his butt look good and showed off his legs quite nicely, he thought. He walked over to his closet, took out a little white blouse and buttoned it up, then slipped on a slouchy gray sweater. He picked out a pair of flats and examined his reflection in the mirror. It was a pretty cute outfit, if he said so himself. He moved to the bathroom and began applying his makeup. He'd picked up a good selection of cosmetics on one of his manic late-night shopping trips over the summer and had slowly been building his makeup skills since then. He didn't need too much today, just some light foundation and some color on his eyes and cheeks. He checked his hair quickly while dabbing on a coat of lip gloss. It had grown so fast he had to get it restyled recently. He wore it up in a ponytail now, but he also liked to let it hang down in little waves on his shoulders some days. Little pearl studs glinted in his ears as he turned to examine his reflection one last time. He flashed a smile at his reflection and the pretty girl in the mirror smiled back. Chris entered the fitness center, pink gym bag slung over his shoulder. Passing the treadmills and stationary bikes, he reviewed his routine in his head, his hands gently miming the dance moves. The locker room he'd been using this semester was on the first floor down the hall from the gym. He quickly changed into his special pink competition leotard, slipped on a pair of workout shorts and made his way to the gymnastics studio. His heart was racing. He could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears as he walked down the hall. He was intensely aware of the sensation of the tight, smooth fabric stretched across his small, pert breasts as he moved. Under his high-cut workout shorts, he could feel the cold breeze of the air conditioner against his smooth legs. He was barefoot, now, and his footsteps echoed lightly against the empty hall as he padded across the cold tile floor. With a shiver, he reflexively tugged the tight sleeves of his leotard around his wrists and smoothed back a stray blonde hair behind his ear, his ponytail bobbing at the back of his head, held in place by a glittery pink scrunchie. He was all alone as he reached the double doors of the gym. He paused, resting a hand on the handle as he studied his reflection in the small window of the door. A delicate face stared back at him, a nervous expression played out across pouting pink lips and rounded, neatly trimmed eyebrows. It seemed so familiar, yet so alien. It was his face, but it wasn't, somehow. He looked down and examined his hands, turning his palms over and back. Had they always seemed this small? His glossy pink nail polish glistened under the fluorescent lights. A swell of anxiety rushed up from somewhere inside him. His head was swimming. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. It was just nerves, he told himself. He shook it off and opened the door, stepping into the bright light of the gym. Coach Matthews greeted him as usual, then led him through some warm-ups and reviewed parts of his routine with him. Finally, Chris stepped out of his workout shorts and took his position in a corner of the spring floor. He extended a leg, toes pointed, then arched his back and struck a dramatic pose, arms outstretched, and waited for Coach Matthews to start the music. They'd been practicing with a small, beat-up boombox. Coach Matthews loaded a CD into the tray and pressed play, watching intently as Chris began his routine. The music started, slow and quiet. He moved into a slow dance that brought him down into a curled pose on the floor, and as the beat of the music slowly built up, he performed a series of fluid turns, curling and uncurling his body. He writhed on the floor, gracefully kicking his legs out into the splits over his head, then rolled and contorted into a backbend before gradually rising to a standing position. Then, leaping and stretching, he broke out in a run towards the opposite corner of the mat, his leotard shimmering and glittering under the harsh gym lights. Coach Matthews called out with a sharp shout of encouragement as Chris launched into a long string of quick flips across the floor, sticking the landing confidently. He flicked his hands up, then pranced to another corner of the big mat, his arms sweeping around him. Despite his intense concentration, his movements exuded a feminine grace as he danced and flexed and tumbled to the beat. He tossed his head, ponytail swishing behind him, as he strutted around on his long legs. He was finally ready, Coach Matthews thought to herself. His mannerisms, his speech, his moods, almost all traces of the boy he'd been were gone, replaced with this new personality, this new body. All that remained was to apply the finishing touches. The poppy, pulsing music reached its peak. Chris paused briefly as he reached the big finish, eyeing his trajectory across the mat before breaking into a sprint. Then, at full speed, he flipped forward onto his hands, launching into a complicated series of flips and turns. He was a high-speed blur of blonde and pink, spinning and bouncing across the floor as the song reached its final crescendo. With one last bounce, he flipped high into the air, landing solidly on his feet, one leg sliding back to absorb the momentum. He thrust his arms in the air, fingers splayed, chest out, beaming. He held the pose for a moment, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through his body. He had done it! He had never felt so proud, so happy. Coach Matthews applauded from the side of the spring floor. Chris bounded towards her excitedly. She hugged the feminine creature tightly and looked him straight in the eyes. "You've done very well, Chris. There's only one thing left to do and your training will be complete." Coach Matthews leaned in and whispered a quiet word into Chris' ear. The boy's eyes instantly glazed over, his body limp in Coach Matthews' arms. The word was a key, unlocking something planted deep in his subconscious. It bloomed and grew like a flower filmed in fast forward, flooding his mind, spreading roots and wrapping vines around his every thought. The fog that had clouded Chris' mind for the last year was clearing, revealing the new personality that had been growing underneath the haze. Chloe gasped for air, suddenly opening her eyes. She was in the gymnastics studio, lying on the floor. Coach Matthews was crouched over her, helping her sit up. "You're okay, Chloe, you're fine." "Owl, what happened?" Her head was throbbing. She squinted under the bright lights of the gym. "You fainted, I think you must be a little dehydrated. Coach Matthews handed Chloe a bottle of water, twisting the cap off for her. Chloe drank slowly as she regained her bearings. The water was cold and refreshing, helping her focus. She could remember performing her routine, but not blacking out. I think we should stop for today. I don't want you to overexert yourself with tryouts coming up. Coach Matthews helped to her feet. I think you've got a real good shot this year. Chloe smiled, putting her weight on Coach Matthews as they walked to the door. Coach was right, it'd be a shame to ruin her chances of making the team with tryouts right around the corner. She'd been working so hard this year, it felt like she hadn't done anything but work out and go to school. She laughed lightly to herself as they made their way down the hall. Epilogue. Coach Matthews looked on approvingly as the girls practiced their routines. The team was looking very good this year. Chloe was across the gym, working on a new routine for the balance beam with an assistant coach, and Coach Matthews watched carefully as they went over the basics. Chloe had easily made the team, and by all accounts was shaping up to be a real asset for the upcoming competitive season. The transformation from Chris to Chloe had been flawless, and now instead of a shabby, directionless boy, she was a beautiful, talented young lady with a bright future. Of course, the same could be said for all the girls on the team. Coach Matthews thought back to the day the representative from TGX International had first shown up at her office, offering an enormous grant in exchange for hosting a pilot program testing some new experimental technologies they'd developed. She'd been extremely apprehensive, of course, but it wasn't like she had much of a choice. TGX had their hands pretty deep in the college's pockets. In fact, the dean himself had paid her a visit shortly afterwards to check that she had accepted the offer. The next semester, she had been provided with a group of delinquent frat boys who had been told they'd been enrolled in a special athletics course. Just one viewing of the special video and they'd been putty in her hands. Once she'd seen the kind of results the program could produce, she'd taken a special pride in shaping rough and tumble boys into perfect little gymnasts, obsessed only with gymnastics, good grades, and pretty outfits. The gymnastics team had grown steadily under her watch, and CDSU had become quite a force in the national conference. Chloe had been a surprise addition to the team, of course. Chris hadn't been nearly as much of a social miscreant as some of his teammates had started out as. In fact, he'd seemed pretty harmless, but any amount of spying on the team could potentially compromise the deal with TGX, so Coach Matthews had taken it upon herself to ensure he wouldn't be a liability. Thankfully, Chris had taken to his training even more easily than the others and blossomed into a very sweet and talented girl. In fact, Coach Matthews checked her clipboard. Chloe was scheduled to finish the last of her smoothie regimen within a few days. After that, her transformation would finally conclude when TGX shipped her off for a round of surgeries, removing the last vestiges of her male anatomy. She'd be back after a couple weeks and Chris would be gone forever. Coach Matthews tapped her clipboard thoughtfully and made a mental note to check her calendar. It'd be a shame if Chloe's procedures conflicted with any competitions.